that I had skipped a whole important Maisa in the book of Yeshua before we got to the farewell speeches. So I'm actually going to move backwards a little bit. The book of Yeshua described the conquest, and it described the division of the land. And then after that, I did mention that the two tribes, Reuven, Gad, and Chatzi Shevet Menashe, who had sworn to Moshe Rabbeinu that even though they were given the east bank of the Yarden, which was the land of Sichon and Og, they will not go back and live there. They will leave their wives and their animals and their children, and they will fight with the rest of the Jewish people in Eretz Yisrael, and they fulfilled their commitment. Meaning they actually were there for 14 years, the 7 years of conquest and the 7 years of division. I think I had raised the question, which I don't have a complete answer, and that is, why did they have to hang around for the 7 years of division? I understand they made a promise they were going to fight, but if the fighting was only 7 years and the other 7 years was Chalukas Haaretz, there was no particular reason why they have to hang around for 7 years away from their homes when Eretz Yisrael is being divided among the other tribes. And yet it's clear from the narrative that they remained west of the Jordan for 14 years. So I think we have to understand, I think the pshat, just to go over this once again, and that is even during the 7 years of division, there were still milchamos going on, meaning to say the following. The first 7 years were national conquests, meaning to say all of the Jewish people or all of the Jewish army were fighting. Once there was division of tribal lands, it then became the responsibility of the individual tribe to try to conquer the unit it was allocated, which had not yet been conquered. Which means there were wars going on for the second 7 years as well, but these were wars not by a national army, but by a tribal army. So Yehuda needed to conquer territory, Yisachar needed to conquer territory, so they were fighting. Now, you may still ask me the question, well, so still, why do the 2.5 tribes have to remain? I mean, given the fact that it's no longer a national endeavor, but each tribe is simply conquering whatever part of its territory was not yet received, why is that the responsibility of Reuven and Gad? But the short answer would be that in these partial conquests, there would be often agreements that would be made in which one tribe would help another tribe, so to speak. So as a result, Reuven and Gad and Chatzi Shevet Menashe had to be available as a supplementary military force. Okay, so again, I made this point many, many times. Even when Eretz Yisrael was divided, there were many people that had Halakim that were not yet conquered, which they couldn't live yet. We'll call that under the water land, I think is the term that they use in real estate and the like. And indeed, we're going to see in the book of Shoftim that this continued in the period of the Judges all the way until David HaMelech. So, in that Perek Chav Beis, we find Reuven and Gad and Chatzi Shevet Menashe remained for 14 years. And finally, Yehoshua sends them home. And I think I had indicated, I'm reviewing a little bit, that this was a kind of a public ceremony so that there should be a permanent memorial that Reuven, Gad, and Chatzi Shevet Menashe faithfully fulfilled their obligation to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and to Moshe Rabbeinu and to Klal Yisrael, and therefore they did not shirk their duty. People might say later, oh, these people on the east of the Yarden, they didn't participate. There needed to be like a public memory of that point. And of course, you'll remember too that Moshe Rabbeinu gave them the land east of the Yarden conditional on their participating in the war. In fact, it's a whole area of halacha, a very important area of halacha, that is derived from the transactions of Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven. Chatzi Shevet Menashe is included. And that's the law of Tanai, just to go over this a little bit. There is a whole body of halacha dealing with the idea of conditions. You can put conditions on a transaction. I can sell you property on the condition that you do something. You can even marry a woman on a condition. Hariat Mukudeshes li almanas, on the condition that I'm a Kohen, or I'll get a job, or whatever it would be. Now, the nature of a condition is, if the condition is fulfilled, that's called a tanai, the transaction is valid. If the condition is not fulfilled, the transaction is invalid, because the transaction was based on a condition. If I'm mocher something to you on a condition, if the tanai is not mekuyam, there's no transfer of ownership. If you marry a woman on a condition and the condition is not mekuyam, she doesn't need a get, because there is no marriage. Again, I'm oversimplifying. Bisman hazeh, we don't do conditional marriages. So if you're under the chuppah and you're not sure if it's going to work out, you don't say Hariat Mekudeshes li on the condition that things work out well for the first year. If they don't work out well for the first year, we're not married. We don't allow that, although some have recommended that as a possible solution for the Aguna crisis. Right? The Aguna crisis is a situation where a husband refuses to give his wife a get for no reason, just for blackmail or whatever it will be. So some have suggested an idea that we ought to put marriages on a condition. This is a valid kedushin only if, in the event a woman demands a get, she gets a get within 30 days or 6 months, whatever time you want to pick. Meaning, if she doesn't get the get, the condition to the marriage was never fulfilled, she was never married, and therefore she doesn't need a get. Meaning, she either gets a get or doesn't need a get. And this has been a very serious proposal, going back, hundreds of years. For reasons I don't want to get into now because it's too far afield. It doesn't work, but be it as it may, but this is a notion of conditions. Now, the law of conditions has many formalities. And the formalities, at least according to Rabbi Meir, not all opinions, have to mimic the conditions that Moshe Rabbeinu imposed on Bnei Gad u Bnei Ruvain, right? So it's very important. The transaction of Moshe with the Bnei Gad u Bnei Ruvain, giving them Ever Liarden, was based on conditions. So according to Rabbi Meir, these are called Mishpatei HaTanoim, the laws, the technicalities of conditional transactions. And some of them are very formalistic. I can't say we have a svara for it. But these are formalities in how you make it tonight. And here are some of the formalities. Number one, you have to state both sides of the equation. Meaning you can't just say, this sale is valid if. You also have to say the sale is invalid if not. Because look at the way Moshe Rabbeinu said. Moshe Rabbeinu said, if you cross the Yarden and fight with your brethren, you will have ownership of Ever Liarden. But he also said, if you don't cross the Yarden and fight with your brethren, you will not have ownership of Ever Liarden. Now, why did he need to state the negative? Could you not infer the negative from the positive? If Moshe Rabbeinu said, I mean, the way contracts are written in English, a typical legal contract does not state both sides. It simply says, this sale is conditional on. It doesn't have to say, if the condition is not kept, the transaction is void. And yet, at least according to Rabbi Meir, not everybody paskins like Rabbi Meir, but at least according to Rabbi Meir, you have to have what is called tanai kafel. Tanai kafel, meaning a doubling of the condition, both in terms of when the transaction would be valid and when the transaction would be invalid. Meaning, if you only said one side of the condition, again, let me sure you understand this, it's not a valid condition. Now be sure you get this. What does it mean to say it's not a valid condition? It means the transaction is valid even if the condition is not fulfilled. Meaning, according to Rabbi Meir, again, I'm not giving you halacha. Many Rishonim don't paskin like Rabbi Meir. But according to Rabbi Meir, if Moshe Rabbeinu would have said, it's counterintuitive, if Moshe Rabbeinu would have said, I am makne you Aver Liyardain on the condition that you cross. And he wouldn't have said, and if you don't cross, no, they would be entitled to Aver Liyardain, even if they didn't cross, because you need a Tanai Kafel to be a Tanai. So that's formality number one. Formality number two is called Hein Kaidem Lalav. Again, we don't really have so many svaras for this. That means the affirmative must precede the negative. Meaning you have to first articulate the validating part of the transaction and only secondarily articulate the invalidity part of the transaction. So you have to say, if you cross, you get. If you don't cross, you don't get. If it would have been reversed, if you don't cross, you don't get. But if you cross, you get. That would be an invalid condition, once again, and the transaction would be valid without the condition. So that's called, so the first one is Tanai Kafel, doubling. The second is Hein, the yes. Kodam Lalav must be before the negative negation. And the third is the condition must be before the Maisa, meaning, again, you can't say you will get Aver Liyardain if you cross. You have to say, if you cross, you will get Aver Liyardain, meaning the condition must be articulated before the Maisa. So these are four rules of Tanai, according to Rabbi Meir. Tanai Kafel. The other is Hein Kaidem Lalav. The other is Tanai, I mentioned three, Tanai Kodem Lamaisa. Yeah, and the fourth rule of Tanai is you can only make a Tanai on transactions that can be effected through a shaliach. Right? Moshe Rabbeinu was makne them land in Eretz Yisrael. Now, sales of land can be done through a shaliach. I can make you a shaliach to sell land for me. So Tanai correlates to things that can be done through shalichus, and anything that cannot be done through shalichus cannot be limited by Tanai. Now, what is an example of that? Maybe the only example of that. I mean, marriage can be done through a shaliach. Divorce can be done through a shaliach. Selling property can be done through a shaliach. Buying property can be done through a shaliach. So shalichus covers almost everything. So an example would be, interesting enough, chalitza. A man dies without children, and either the almana doesn't want yibam, or the brother doesn't want yibam, whatever it would be. So in order for her to marry, he has to give her chalitza, which means she takes off his shoe and she spits in front of him and says, so shall be done to the man whom does not want to marry his brother's widow. And that releases her, right? Chalitza is the ceremony that releases the yavama, allowing her to marry. Well, let's say the yavam is a bit of a blackmailer, and he says, this is a valid chalitza only if you give me $200 by the end of the week. And he says it the right way. Technically, he has to say, if you give me $200 by the end of the week, this is a valid chalitza. Let's say he does it that way. Which means, is she stuck? Does she have to come up with the $200? And if she doesn't have chalitza, she can't get married. So here, the Gemara explains that through various psukim and gezeres hakosovs, we darshan that chalitza cannot be done through a shaliach. Okay, that's a drasha the Gemara has. Once we establish you cannot do chalitza through a shaliach, it will automatically follow under the Mishvatei HaTanoim that you can't make a Tanai in chalitza either, because the ability to make a Tanai in a transaction is connected to the ability to make a shaliach. What exactly is the correlation? It seems to be a certain element of control over the process, meaning if I can make a shaliach over a process, I have a certain sholita over it, and that sholita can then extend to imposing conditions and limitations. If it's a transaction over which I don't have that sholita, I can't. Okay, again, this is very, very, very much a digression, but it is important that you know that Bnei Gad Bnei Ruvain is not just a story, it is actually the source of very, very important halachas of Mishvatei HaTanoim. That also means that according to Rabbi Meir, when Mishnayos describe Tanai, they're never really doing it accurately. So for example, you'll read in the Mishnah Kedushin, many cases of Tanai, it says, HaMakadesh Esoisha Almanah Shani Kohen. If a man marries a woman on the condition that he's a Kohen. So when you read that Mishnah, you figure he said the words, Hareyat Mekudeshesli, on the condition that I'm a Kohen. But that wouldn't be right, according to Reb Meir. He would have to say, if I'm a Kohen, you're married. Meaning the Mishnah does not bother, so to speak, to articulate all the formalities. The Mishnah expresses Tanoim in its cases, B'lashon Ketzara, in a more abbreviated way. But if you wanted to actually make it Tanai, you'd have to comply with different formalities that the Mishnah does not always address. Meaning there are places where the Mishnah gives you the halachas, but otherwise, just for the brevity of the Mishnah, it does not go through the positive and the negative every time. Okay, but be it as it may, Bnei Gad Bnei Ruvain have kept their promise. They are sent home. They have been gone for 14 years. Unbelievable. Does that mean they didn't see their families at all? No, as I said, they could have been given leave, just like our soldiers in Israel. They could have, it's not so far to cross the Yarden, etc. So perhaps they did have visits home. Perhaps they had leaves even for Yom Tov or whatever it would be. But more or less, they were on military duty for 14 years. They go home, and they're an example of great nobility and hishtatfus. In fact, I don't want to get into the issue of charedim in the army, but the most common verse that Hester and other people often cite is Moshe Rabbeinu's statement back in Parshas Matos, Acheichem yotzim lemilchama. It's a pasuk in the Chumash. Your brethren are going out to war. V'atem teishvu po, and you are sitting here east of the Yarden. How dare you entertain such a thought? Now, I understand you can't just quote a pasuk rhetorically and say, that makes the case. But that pasuk itself is the fundamental, so to speak, hashkafa of the Hester yeshivos that combine Torah learning and military service by Moshe Rabbeinu's tochacha of how dare you sit tight and pretty in your territory when the rest of the Jewish people are fighting. Again, I don't want to get into this now. Obviously, you don't prove things by just citing a single pasuk. One can make a million differences between the modern situation and that situation, but philosophically, that pasuk is actually a very, very central point in the argument. Okay, so everything's good. Of course, there is interesting halachic shilas. Well, gee, were 2.5 tribes living in Chutz La'aretz? What is the halachic status of the land of the 2.5 tribes? Did you have to take truma and meiser from the produce? Did they have to observe the laws of Shemitah? Because once again, Ever Yarden is not within the boundaries of Eretz Yisrael. It is outside of Eretz Yisrael. So what is the halachic status, or what was the halachic status of that area? As you would expect, it's a big machlokes, but many poskim do take, and many Rishonim take the position that because Ever Yarden was conquered by Moshe Rabbeinu, this was the war against Sichon and Og, with a divine command, it does have the Kedusha. It's a lower level of Kedusha, but it does have the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael with respect to the mitzvos Tuluyos Baretz. So therefore, in Eivor Liyarden, they did have to take off Trumos and Masros and observe the laws of Shemitah. The interesting question is, well, so would that be true today? Let's assume, I'm traveling in Jordan and I buy a banana or something. I assure you there is no rabbinical authority in Jordan who's taking off Trumos and Masros. Would I have to take off Trumos and Masros? So again, Bizman Hazeh, there are reasons where the Kedusha is Nifka. There is no Kedusha there now, but when the two tribes were living there, Eivor Liyarden did have, on some level, the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael, even though it was not within the boundaries of Eretz Yisrael. But Eivor Liyarden had Kedusha Sa'aretz for the mitzvahs Tuluyos B'Aretz. Okay, so they get sent home, everything's good, and all of a sudden, there's this rumor that reaches Bnei Yisrael, west of the Jordan, that the tribes east of the Yarden have erected a giant Mizbeach. A giant Mizbeach. Now remember that the Mishkan right now is in Shiloh. There's no Beis HaMikdash yet until Shlomo HaMelech's time, but the Mishkan is in Shiloh, where it was for more than 360 years. And once you have the Mishkan in Shiloh, remember, just to remind you, for the first 14 years, the 7 years of conquest and the 7 years of division, the Mishkan was in Gilgal. And when the Mishkan was in Gilgal for those 14 years, bumos, private altars were permitted. You could bring a korban in your backyard. You didn't have to go to Gilgal. But after the 14 years, there was more of a permanent, it was still a Mishkan, but it had stone walls, a permanent Mishkan in Shiloh. And at that point, bumos are prohibited. You can only bring a korban in the Mishkan of Shiloh, which is in the Chelek of Ephraim. So, if Eivor Liyarden is building their own gigantic altar, there's only one of two things that are going on here. Either, chas v'shalayim, they're building it to Avodah Zarah, which is obviously horrendous. But even if they're building it for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, this is an Aveira, because, for which you're chayiv kares, to bring a korban outside of the Beis HaMikdash or outside of the Mishkan when the Mishkan prohibits the bringing of those korbanos. And it's also a political statement because the idea would be they're separating themselves from the Jewish people and trying to create their own society. Very dangerous. So as a result, there was kind of I thought that maybe we have to wage war, like a civil war, against the South that is seceding from the Union and worshiping Avodah Zarah. And of course, that's going to bring a Midas Hadin on Klal Yisrael. On Klal Yisrael. Right? If part of the Jewish people are sinful, all of us get punished for that. So as a result, there actually was an attempt in the lifetime of Yoshua that perhaps we have to wage war against these two tribes to be sure that they're not breaking away. But Baruch Hashem, it turned out that it was the opposite idea, that essentially they built a model that resembled the Mishkan there as a monument to remind the kids that are growing up Eivor Liyarden that our true kesher is to Eretz Yisrael and the Mizbeach in Shiloh. Okay, that's what it was. Excuse me, I just have to... Was this thought that this Mizbeach was a Mizbeach li'Avodah Zarah or a Mizbeach for Hashem outside of Mishkan Shiloh, which would have been a Chiyuv Kares of a korban outside of the Beis HaMikdash. And politically, it was an attempt to create a separate nation. And the fear was that this would bring Hashem's wrath on Am Yisrael. So the other Shvatim wanted to wage war, and instead they encountered that Fakert. This was not an attempt to separate from the West Bank, west of the Klal Yisrael, but this was designed to be a replica, just like, people have in their houses in Chutz La'aretz, they'll have a picture of the Kaisel. They're not creating a rival Beis HaMikdash. It's Fakert. It's a way of remembering and connecting to the Beis HaMikdash. And they said there was a real fear, and think about this, that in the course of time, in the course of centuries, the people east of the Yarden would look at themselves as a separate nation. And therefore, they needed to have their minds focused on the Mishkan and Shiloh as the fundamental central point. And Baruch Hashem, so the story had a happy ending. For some reason, I forgot to mention the story earlier. The story had a happy ending, and there was a lot of achdus. Of course, let me just remind you that the very end of the story is not so great. We know, of course, that the 10 tribes were exiled before the Yehuda and Binyamin, but even within the 10 tribes, the tribes of Aver LeYarden were the very first to be exiled. So in some ways, it's almost as if Bnei Israel had a premonition that this separation would result in a spiritual separation as well. So that was hundreds of years later, but Reuven and Gad were the first tribes to be exiled by Sancherib, the king of Assyria, even before the rest of the 10 tribes were exiled that were west of the Yarden. Okay, so that's kind of it. Now, again, then we go back to the farewell speeches, but let me just end with a very interesting bibliographic point. We are told that Yehoshua died at the age of 110. It's a good old age, but a little short of Moshe. Moshe was 120, Yeshua was 110. Now, this creates a certain problem that we have, and that is, Chazal seem to understand that when Yeshua entered Eretz Yisrael after the death of Moshe, there were 7 years of conquest and 7 years, 7 years of conquest and 7 years of Chalukah. Now, here's the question. How old was Yehoshua when he became the leader, when they crossed the Yarden and he became the leader? Now, we know how old Kalev was. Kalev tells us himself he was 40 years old at the time of the Meraglim. If Kalev was 40 years old at the time of the Meraglim, then he was 80 years old at the time they entered Eretz Yisrael. And in fact, Kalev says that as well. Remember, Kalev wanted Hebron, and Kalev said, "Behold, I am 80 years old, and my strength is just as it was when I was younger." So Kalev, there's no mystery. Kalev was 40 at the time of the Meraglim, and Kalev was 80 when they entered the land. We don't know b'diuk how old Yoshua was. But many people assume, turns out to be wrongly, that Yoshua was the same age as Kalev. We kind of look at them as the Babzi twins, so to speak, but even though they're not twins. Now, you see, though, it's impossible that Yoshua could have been 40. If Yoshua would have been 40, then he too would have been 80 when they entered Eretz Yisrael. And after the 7 years of conquest and the 7 years of Chiluk, which is only 14 years, he would have been 94. He would have been 94. And if he died shortly after the division of the land, then how do you get to 110? You're missing 16 years. So the truth is, Chazal actually invent, I mean they had a Messiah, I don't mean invent, but it's not in the Psukim at all. The impression you get from the book of Yoshua is Yoshua died after 14 years of leadership. Sheva shanim shechilka, kavshu, Sheva shanim shechilka, then he gives his speeches, and then he dies. But if that's the problem, How old was he when he became leader? So Chazal have the following idea. Chazal say that even though Yoshua's death is recorded shortly after they divided the land, in fact, he was a leader for another 14 years. In other words, Yoshua's leadership was 28 years, not 14 years. And then you get pretty close. If he was 40 like Kalev, he was 80 with Bias Haaretz. He was 94 after the 7 years of Kibush, the 7 years of Chiluk, 94. And then another 14 years. So what does that give him? 108. Well, close, but no cigar, as the expression goes. 108 is very close to 110, but it's not 110. So because of this, Seder HaOlam posits that Yehoshua was 2 years older than Kalev. So Kalev was 40 at the time of the Meraglim. Yehoshua was 42. If you go with 42, the cheshbon works b'diuk. Again, Yehoshua was 42 at the time of the Meraglim. He was 82 40 years later when they crossed the Yarden. 7 years of Kibush, 7 years of 7 years of Kibush, 7 years of Chiluk, 82 plus 14 is 96. Chazal then posits, which is not in the Psukim, another 14 years of leadership until his death, and that will get him to the age of 110. And this is the idea that Yoshua was a manig for 28 years. Now, the truth of the matter is, this is what Chazal's Messiah is, and this is what's recorded. Yoshua was Noheg Sarara for 28 years. But the truth is, it has many, many problems. Because why weren't they, what did they do those last 14 years? Why did they leave? The book of Shoftim records all the areas that were not conquered. Why wasn't Joshua involved in that conquest? So because of this, the Ibn Ezra, who often does not follow the chronology of Chazal, that's a question in and of itself, posits that there were no 14 extra years. Yoshua was only a manhig for the 14 years of Kibush, the 14 years of Chiluk, and he died shortly thereafter. So the question then becomes, what was his age? So the Ibn Ezra says Yoshua was much older than Kalev. Yoshua was 56. Kalev was 40. Yoshua was 56 at the time of the Meraglim. Now, does that work? 56, so he was 96, crossing the Yarden. 7 years, 96 and 14 is how much? 96 and 14. My math is atrophying here. 110. Is what? 110. 110? I'm sorry, 96 and 14 is 110. That's right. That's exactly right. So therefore, according to the Ibn Ezra, we don't have that extra 14 years. Now, maybe I'll leave it for tomorrow to elaborate a little bit. There is, again, the weakness of the Ibn Ezra is it's Keneged Chazal. But there's an enormous mila to the Ibn Ezra, and that is, the Navi says in the book of Shoftim that between Yehoshua and the first Shofet, Osniel ben Kenaz, there was a period of the Zekanim. And according to the Ibn Ezra, the elders were able to rule for 14 years. Those are in other words, the 14 years that Seder Olam allocates to Yehoshua leaves no room for the Zekanim through the chronology of the book. So where do you fit the Zekanim in? Like the Ibn Ezra, you have a nice 14-year period where Yoshua was the leader for 14 years. Then you have the Zakanim. We'll talk about who they were for 14 years. And then you have the Shoftim. According to Seder Olam chronology, Yoshua was leader for 28 years. And then the Cheshbon would lead you to a Shofet, and there's no period of time where the Zakanim would rule, and yet the Pasuk in Shoftim says there was a period of Zakanim who were Mairich Yomim after Yeshua ben Nun. So the Eben Ezra does have that tremendous maila of giving you a makom for this canon. Again, I'll explain this a little bit more. I'm a little makatzer on this, and that is why in the famous Chronicle, the Sefer is actually right outside here. If you ever would look at it, Seder Hadoros. Did you ever see the Sefer? It's a red cover. You might notice it on the shelf. Seder Hadoros is actually a very, very interesting Sefer. It was written in the 1500s by a great guy, and a big Talmud Chacham, one of the Gedolei Ador itself. But it attempts to reconstruct chronologies from Tanakh and even from the Gemara, all the way through the Gemara, in terms of Amoraim, Tanoim, and the like. And the Seder Olam will often bring, not Seder Olam, Seder Hadoros. Seder HaOlam is from the Tanoim. Seder HaOlam is from the Tanoim. Seder Hadoros is from an early Achron, who looks at all the different sources and comes up with different opinions on different things. Obviously, Seder Olam is a very important source for Seder Hadoros. But the Seder Hadoros uses many other sources as well. And the Seder Hadoros does bring two deis. He discusses the deis Be'arichos. Was Yoshua a shofet for 28 years, a leader for 28 years, followed immediately by the Shoftim? Or was Yoshua leader for only 14 years, and then you had a 14-year period of Zakanim, followed by Shoftim? See, everybody's motive that Shoftim began at a certain date. So the question is, did Yoshua go up to that date, or was there some space in which the Zakanim could move in? So it's a very, very difficult problem. The truth is, like Chazal, again, we'll go over this again, it's extremely difficult to figure out where the Zakanim had any leadership at all, since you go straight from Yoshua to the Shoftim. But we'll talk about that later. Okay.
Thank you for listening to this Ohr Somayach production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.